This is going to be the last chunk of information that you'll need to watch for April break. This is genetics, and it will be the last segment of new material before we start reviewing for the AP exam. So when we talk about genetics, it's kind of a culmination of a bunch of different things that we've talked about. Things like colorblindness, polydactyly, having multiple fingers, normal genetic traits that we see all the time, be it a cleft chin or a widow's peak or freckles. All of these things we see pop up really frequently, and they are all caused by genetics. When we first learn about genetics and biology, we remember Mendel. And hopefully some of the things that we learn are these terms when we talk about Gregor Mendel and his pea plants, right? The idea that he was able to crossbreed pea plants and use Punnett squares to determine what the offspring are going to be. If you don't know any of these terms, please pause me in class and we'll go over them, but it's really important that you remember most of these terms already. I'm going to go through those terms as fast as possible. I won't really pause. If you need to pause this video, please do, but this should just be a refresher of stuff that you already know. So remember that the genotype is going to be either homozygous, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive. The phenotype is the resulting physical images that we see. In the pea plants, the thing that we most common saw, well, he looked at a couple different things. He looked at the color of the flowers, either white or purple. Pea plants have flowers. He also looked at the color of the pea, either yellow or green, and he looked at whether they were wrinkled or smooth. What he found was that often one physical trait was more dominant than the other. And so if they were heterozygous, it often took the place of the other trait. Here we see the different options that show up. On top of the flowers and the peas, we also have two different heights, a tall or a dwarf plant, and we have like two different growth patterns, the axial growth pattern and the terminal growth pattern. This is Mendel. He worked in, he was a monk. That's all we really need to know about him. So when we get to the nitty gritty of genetics, this is the more AP version. We know that within the DNA, there are certain genes that code for the proteins that are going to cause certain physical traits. In the pea plants, we've got a purple allele and we've got a white allele, and they are just different proteins that can be made by the same length of DNA or the same gene. For each trait, we have a pair of chromosomes, one from the mother and one from the father plant. And depending on what their allele says, will determine what the offspring have. And so in this case, we see that one plant, one parent plant, provided the big P or the purple flower allele, and one plant provided the white flower allele. This is the curriculum framework for the AP biology test. Feel free to read through this if you want. This is what you need to know, but it's not imperative that you know this. So when we get to the cross or the Punnett square, we follow the law of dominance. If two alleles at the locus differ, then one, the dominant one, determines the organism's appearance and the other has no noticeable effects. So, for example, yellow pea plants is recessive. Therefore, if I have heterozygous, big G, little g, my peas are still going to be green. Human traits with simple dominance, or traits that if one of your parents have them, you will have them. Widow's peak, whatever right or left-handed, right hand is dominant. Free earlobes versus attached earlobes, cleft chin, dimples, freckles, bent little fingers, nearsightedness, all of these things are going to be determined by whichever organism has, or whichever parent has this trait and is dominant. Dominance does not always mean more numerous, although that is often the case, right? So if being right-handed is more dominant, we also see that there's a higher frequency of people who are right-handed. Dominant alleles are not necessarily more common. For example, 1 out of 400 babies is born with extra fingers and toes, but it is a dominant trait if the organism gets that allele. These are some kind of check questions. Feel free to check yourself if you want. More curriculum framework. I put this in more for my edification than for yours, so you can skip it. So the law of segregation, or how do we get here? The two alleles for a heritable character separate during gamete formation and end up in different gametes. So you, for every trait, have two alleles for your trait. So I have hazel eyes, I have two alleles for my hair colors. When I make eggs, those two alleles separate, and so some of my eggs will carry one allele, and some of them will carry the other. Here we see this occurring. We always separate the organisms. This is how we use Punnett squares. Feel free to pause this if you need an update on Punnett, or kind of a refresher on Punnett squares. My assumption is that you know how, but if you don't, feel free to pause this. When we are doing when we're looking at multiple traits in a cross, we need to be able to separate them all in a certain way. So we may use this type of cross as well. When we talk about the law of independent assortment, this means that every combination, it functions independently of the other combinations. If you do not know how to do dihybrid crosses on Punnett squares, please ask me in class and we will stop, but I'm not going to go over it here. Feel free to answer this to check your knowledge if you'd like to. Again, more questions, and we'll move on from here. So how do we calculate genetics? This is the next sort of information that we need to know. How do we predict offspring? We use these tables to track different traits. The male is going to be square, female is going to be circular, and then anything that is colored in is going to be, oh, Dee Dee, stop stepping on my laptop. Anything that is colored in is going to be an affected individual. So we can track traits and look at who passed certain traits on. If we look at the widow's peak example, we can see that the two sets of grandparents, the first generation, the male had a widow's peak in the first marriage, and the female had a widow's peak in the second. The first pairing had 4 kids. 2 out of the 4 had widow's peaks, and in the second grandparent set, they had 2 children, and 1 had the widow's peak. Then we see that the male and the female with widow's peaks came together, and they had 1 offspring with a widow's peak and 1 without. This allows us to typically determine if a phenotype is homozygous or heterozygous. These pedigree charts are really great for tracking traits, but sometimes when we get far away from the first and second generation, it means that we have a really hard time assessing genotype. This allows us to determine phenotype really well. Answer these questions if you want to practice looking at pedigrees. When we talk about probability, it is simple math when we're talking about what's the percent chance that we end up with a certain trait. Punnett squares make it really, really easy because each square represents 25%. If, for example, in the penny one, having a heads-tails combination is 50% because it takes up 2 out of the 4 squares. This is the rule of addition. I can just add up my separate probabilities, and it results in what the probability will be for my Punnett square. The rule of multiplication states that the probability that 2 or more independent events will occur is the product of their individual probabilities. So the chance that 2 or more independent events will occur together, for example, when I toss 2 coins at the same time, the probability that they will end heads up needs to be multiplied as opposed to just added like we do with the Punnett square. So if you would like to practice, do this Punnett square. Pause it here, do this Punnett square. You should get this answer. If you do not, we can talk about it in class. So a little bit more probability. We're not going to talk very much about this because this doesn't really come up in the AP exam. If you want to talk about it, we can bring it up. More probability. We, again, are not going to focus too much on probability. We're going to focus more on the other information. If you want to practice more of this, this is a link to help you out.